In the west, Allied forces had been preparing for months to open a new front in northwest France. Training for it was well underway. But it was an attack Hitler had long been expecting. His problem was knowing when, and above all where, it would come. The stage was set for one of the greatest battles of World War II, D-Day, the Allied landings along the Normandy coast of France. Since the early years of the war, Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had always been certain that at some point an Allied invasion of Northern Europe would be necessary. The only questions were when, where, and how. To test the waters, British forces had already mounted a number of practice operations. The Dieppe disaster reinforced the British view that an invasion of Europe could not be rushed. Churchill understood it would require careful planning. Eventually, in April 1943, at an Allied conference in Washington, Churchill and the US President Franklin Roosevelt agreed upon a date. D-Day, or Operation Overlord as the seaborne invasion of France was formally called, would take place in the summer of 1944. But by now, the Germans were preparing for it in earnest. Since the winter of 1941, they had been building an Atlantic wall. It was a massive series of fortifications running along the European coast from Denmark to the Spanish border. Gun emplacements had been constructed at likely landing sites. Beaches had been mined and covered in barbed wire. Obstacles had been placed in strategic places to block landing craft. Hitler had boasted, "I am the greatest builder of fortifications of all time." In the summer of 1942, in the wake of the Dieppe attack, work on the Atlantic Wall had been stepped up. Hitler had also ordered an increase in troop numbers in the region. In Britain, the Allied planners were also grappling with the problem of location. Where was the best place to land? Their chief planner, General Frederick Morgan, quickly realized there were two principal options, the Pas-de-Calais and Normandy. The Pas-de-Calais was clearly the favorite. It offered the shortest sea crossing, and it offered the shortest and most direct way to Germany. But it was also the most obvious route, and Morgan was sure the Germans were expecting it. So he decided to wrong-foot them. Morgan would land in Normandy. It was the beginning of a huge gamble on which the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers would depend. The answer was to keep them guessing until the very last moment as to where the invasion would take place. Operation Bodyguard was a massive and complex deception campaign. German double agents in Britain now began sending back to Germany huge amounts of carefully coordinated false information. This emphasized that the main landings would be in the Pas-de-Calais, although a feint attack might be launched in Normandy. To muddy the waters still further, the Allied military created a fictitious army unit the so-called 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. It was stationed, very obviously, in Kent, bang opposite the Pas-de-Calais. The man in charge of it was the pistol-toting U.S. General George Patton, who'd been removed from action in Sicily after slapping shell-shocked soldiers. Patton was rated by the Germans as the Allies' best attacking general. Just the man they expected to command the invasion of Western Europe.
Basher 5-2, this is Basher 1-1 on Alpha.
Radio transmissions mimicked the wireless traffic of an army. For the benefit of any Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flying over Britain, the fields of Kent were filled with inflatable tanks and carefully faked track marks. There were dummy aircraft made of wood and canvas. Harbors along the Kent coast were filled with dummy landing craft. There were even troops, though these were in reality backup units. In late 1943, the Allies appointed U.S. General Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe. Two months before the landing, Eisenhower launched an elaborate air offensive to disrupt German links to the coast. As the date of the invasion approached, Allied troop numbers in England reached over 2 million. They were supported by more than 3,000 tanks and 12,000 aircraft. The Germans were well aware an invasion was imminent. But they had been completely taken in by the Allies' phony preparations in Kent and were convinced the most likely landing spot was the Pas-de-Calais. Everything seemed to be going the Allies' way. The troops were briefed. Then the weather turned against them. "Let's go," he said. Operation Overlord, the greatest sea-borne invasion ever, was underway. D-Day had begun. The Allies had launched their great gamble to invade Hitler's empire in Western Europe. "50 miles to the west, US paratroops came down around the village of Saint-Mère-Église. There was a fierce firefight. But 3 hours later, the village was in US hands. One of the most crucial battles of World War II was underway. An hour later, horrified German sentries along the Normandy coast saw a vast armada appear out of the mist. They had had no warning. Allied warships off the Normandy coast now began pounding the German defensive positions. Wave after wave of aircraft swept overhead. Under cover of the bombardment, assault troops headed for the shore. But as they closed in, German artillery and machine guns opened fire. A number of the landing craft were hit. Others fell foul of underwater obstructions. But at 6:30 in the morning, the first waves of troops hit the beaches. At the far western end, the US 4th Infantry Division came ashore near at what they called Utah Beach. Within 2 hours, it was linking up with the US paratroopers who'd landed at Saint-Mère-Église. Next door, at Omaha Beach, it was more difficult. The beach was a defender's dream, with high cliffs and few ways inland. As the US 1st Infantry Division waded ashore, they were mown down by German machine guns. To make matters worse, the Americans' amphibious tanks were swamped. The troops were trapped on the beach. Disaster was looming. But finally, a few of the soldiers managed to scale the cliffs. Against all the odds, the Americans hung on to the beachhead. Further east, in the center of the landing area, Britain's 50th Infantry Division came ashore at Gold Beach. They too met savage fire. By early afternoon, the Allies had successfully established all of the beachheads. The timing of the invasion had caught the Germans completely by surprise. They'd expected the Allies to wait until the weather had cleared. Rommel, the operational German commander for the whole of the northwest French coast, had taken the opportunity of bad weather to visit his family in Germany. His immediate subordinate in Normandy and Brittany, General Friedrich Dollmann, was over 100 miles away, taking part in a war game exercise. Only the overall German commander for the whole of Western Europe, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was at his HQ. But he needed Hitler's permission to move his panzer reserves to the battlefield. However, Hitler was asleep, and his aides wouldn't wake him. It wasn't until midday that the Führer finally learnt about the invasion, but he didn't take it seriously. He was still convinced the main attack would come in the Pas-de-Calais. Normandy, he believed, was just a feint. Finally, in the late afternoon, when the scale of the invasion was becoming all too clear, Hitler unleashed his reserves. But they were too far away to provide immediate support. Despite stubborn German resistance, the beachheads around Utah, Gold and Juneau and Sword were secure. Only at Omaha was the situation more precarious. Here, German resistance had prevented the US troops moving more than a mile inland. By nightfall on June the 6th, over 100,000 Allied troops had been landed in Normandy. It had been an extraordinary feat of planning, ingenuity, and courage. The first day of the Allies' great gamble had paid off. But it was just the beginning. Now they had to build up, break out, and push on into Europe.